Good evening. Goodbye Forever by Ngak'chang RInpoche, Volume 2. Chapter 10, Ocean of Space. The initial training in iconographic drawing continued. Sherab Palden Beru began to give me a great deal of information, and I wrote it all down in my notebook. Before beginning to draw, the first necessity was to determine the vertical axis. This is followed by the horizontal line and the 4 outer lines for defining the edges of the painting area. There were 8 major lines, 2 diagonals, the vertical, the horizontal, and 4 bordering lines. The first 2 of the 8 major lines were the diagonal lines drawn from one corner of the canvas to its diagonal opposite. These 2 lines facilitated the placing of the vertical and horizontal. To draw these lines, one needed a chalked marking string. A simple chalk line could be obtained by rubbing a length of string with chalk powder between the hands. The chalk line mostly used was a string passed through a powder bag. This bag would be made of leather or cloth, and the marking powder was often a mixture of ochre and charcoal. Lines were made by positioning and snapping the string against the canvas. These lines were called dry lines. When using a chalk line with a stick, one could use both hands to hold the string and twang it to create the line. One fastened the string to the end of the stick, so a notch needed to be incised at the end and a groove around the circumference of the stick. To fasten the string to the stick, the string should be pulled through the notched end and then wrapped and tied around the shaft within the groove. There is much more information I could give here, but it would be better placed in a book about tanka painting. Suffice it to say that I took copious notes. I continued candle making, yak feeding, and engaging with the morning and evening meditation sessions in the shrine room. There was plentiful conversation. I provided a great deal of information about Vajrayana in the Nyingma tradition. People had almost endless questions. The books available at the time were mainly academic and incomprehensible to anyone apart from scholars, and it was by no means certain what benefit scholars derived from them. The atmosphere at that time was characterised by an enormous hunger for useful knowledge concerning Vajrayana. After my meeting with Ngak'chang RInpoche, even the slightly remote Jarvis became friendly and asked a few questions in a cordial manner. I acted as if he'd never been obnoxious, and he, on his part, acted accordingly. He'd joined us in my room on my last night, and I'd welcomed him to pull up a cushion. Chögyam, he opened. I was wondering whether they have Ngakpas in the Kyabjé school. Yes, they do, especially in the Ngakpa Chögyam and Düd'jom schools, but they have them in all branches of the Kyabjé. After all, Milarepa and his disciple Rinpoche were not monastics. There were other non-monastic disciples of Milarepa too. Ngak'chang Repa, Repa Shiwa, Ban Repa, Kira Repa, Düd'jom Repa, and Repa Sangyekab. There were others too, but those are the only ones I can recall. Of course, Jarvis nodded. I was forgetting about the Repas. Can you still find Repas in India? Yes, there are a wonderful gathering of them at Tashijong who are associated with Ngak'chang RInpoche. There they're called the Togdens, and they practice incredibly rigorous psychophysical yogas. Jarvis wanted to know more, and so I commenced to tell him what I knew. It was the 8th Ngak'chang RInpoche who established a community for the preservation of Vajrayana for the Ngakpa Chögyam Togdens, monastics and lay people who had followed him into exile from Kham. They all worked together to build Khampaga Gompa to replicate what they had left behind in Tibet. Every spring they perform Ngak'chang to celebrate the birth of Padmasambhava. This Vajrayana dance was first performed in Tibet 300 years ago. The Ngak'chang RInpoche is a master of Ngak'chang. "What do these dances look like?" asked Jan. "Well, the dancers are dressed in brocade robes and they move according to an intricate yet dramatically dauntless choreography. It's alternately wild and stately. Hard to describe, really, but the dancers swirl, often spinning around on one leg with the other raised. It is Mahayoga meditation in movement, manifesting visualization as dance." "Are these dances ever performed by women?" asked Jan. "Yes, although it would be rather more rarely seen. Khandro Tenzin Drolkar was skilled in Ngak'chang." Jan inquired, so I gave her some detail. Khandro Tenzin Drolkar had spent some time at Tashijong before she married Ngakpa Yeshe Dorje, and she had learned Ngak'chang from one of the Togdens there. There were a group of amazing Togdens: Togden Chule, Togden Zopa, Togden Tachog, Togden Arjam, and Togden Artrin. Later, Togden Semdor and Togden Achu were able to escape and join Ngak'chang RInpoche. Togden Chögyam was known as Togden Rinpoche, as he is the main meditation teacher in Tashijong. Khandro Tenzin Drolkar studied with Togden Artrin for a time, because although he was ostensibly Drukpa Kagyu, he was mainly Nyingma Dzogchen in terms of practice. She told me that in Tibet he'd been in solitary retreat for 6 years, but at that point he'd felt that his practice had become slow and turgid. He told Khandro Tenzin Drolkar that he felt his practice had turned him into a serene vegetable. "That's very funny," laughed Kate. "It sounds almost un-Tibetan." Oh, Togden Artrin had a fine sense of humour, according to Khandro Tenzin Drolkar, and a way of expressing himself that was quite individual. Anyhow, Togden Artrin asked Ngak'chang Rinpoche whether it might help him to practice in a more rugged, inhospitable place, perhaps even a frightening place. Ngak'chang Rinpoche had agreed and given directions to a specific location. Having arrived, Togden Artrin found a large cave into which the sun never shone. In the evening, a flock of noisy pigeons flapped around inside, defecating, so he'd get splattered with pigeon excrement. Wild laughter ensued at this point, and I had to wait for the gathering to calm down. I wondered what it was about people that made defecation such an amusing topic. Anyhow, I continued, Togden Artrin placed a container to collect the water trickling down the rock face, but when he drank the water it tasted vile. He then realised the water was partly pigeon's urine. Again, the gathering found this highly amusing, and I began to feel awkward about the account. I had not meant to amuse people, and although I enjoyed being entertaining and telling jokes, I found myself feeling that I would rather not be seen as someone who made these stories comical. "So," I resumed, "the cave was wet and noisy. It was frightening at night because of the strange sounds that seemed to erupt out of nowhere. These sounds were not sounds made by pigeons, but by other creatures he could not see." He found that his former tranquillity had vanished entirely and was perplexed as to how he should proceed. He concluded that whatever he'd practiced in the past was of little use. So he tried to cultivate greater calm by not surrendering to distraction within any of the sense fields. He took all phenomena as equal, and in this mode he remained in that cave for a further 6 years. After that, nothing affected him, and whatever occurred, he never left the state of Rigpa. So there really are yogis just like Milarepa today, Jarvis beamed. Certainly, and others with the same realization who've endured fewer austerities, such as Khandro Tenzin Drolkar. She's very much a Dzogchen yogini. Jarvis then asked, did Khandro Tenzin Drolkar practice the 6 yogas of Naropa? Yes, and especially the physical yogas belonging to the Trulkor system. So Togden Artrin was her Tsawai Lama? Asked Jarvis. No, her Tsawai Lama is Karma Gyalpo Rinpoche. He's one of the greatest living Tsalung Karma Mudra masters, but I've not met him. Jarvis proceeded to get highly technical at that point and ask all manner of questions. Although fascinating, I started feeling concerned that the others were being left out of the conversation. I therefore excused myself on the pretext that I needed to pay a visit to the toilet. I remained away just long enough to allow another stream of conversation to take over and strolled back to my room. By the time I returned, they were talking about Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. We were talking about the fact that you both have the name Chögyam. Is there some connection? Asked Kate. No, not apart from the fact that I have a great deal of respect for Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He's really the first Lama to communicate in contemporary English, and I find that an enormous inspiration. Our names, however, are not exactly the same. Trungpa Rinpoche's name is a contraction of Chö-Kyi Gyamtso, and mine is a contraction of Chö-Ying Gyamtso. Chö-Kyi Gyamtso means ocean of Dharma, and Chö-Ying Gyamtso means ocean of space, or oceanic Chö-Ying. Chö-Ying? Inquired Jan. That's Dharma Dhatu in Sanskrit. You speak Tibetan then? No, I wish I did. I know the technical language of Vajrayana to a certain degree, but I can't string it into a sentence. I can only say, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to town, or wish people sit in comfort when I'm leaving, and other social pleasantries. And so we moved through ideas until they all drifted off to bed. It had been an extremely pleasant last evening, and I was happy that Jarvis had been there. It fulfilled something important in my mind. It was possible for human beings to be friends and to accept each other as equally valuable. The warm glow of such comradeship was the ideal mood in which to go to sleep on the final night at Sami Ling. So I packed my robes away. Tomorrow I'd be back in my civvies again, ready to hit the road. I'd got into bed and just turned out the light when Jan appeared in my room, slipped out of her dress and climbed into bed. In as relaxed a manner as I was capable, I said, Jan, I'd be extremely happy about this under other circumstances, but I'm not single, you know. That's a shame, but I'm only looking for a cuddle. A woman needs that from time to time. Nothing else has to happen. It's not a life or death decision, you know. What was I going to say to that? It took a moment or two, but finally I said, This is completely outside my sense of what's possible, but I'll take your word for it, and I wouldn't like to be ungentlemanly." Nothing more was said. She spooned up behind me and went to sleep almost immediately, as far as I could tell by her rate of breathing. I, on the other hand, lay awake for something close to eternity. It may have been 20 minutes, but it was 20 minutes crammed with concept. I had a range of ideas and sensations that were difficult to reconcile. I knew that in some way I could have found myself teetering for a microsecond on a pivotal molecule of precariousness. I was a 16th of an inch from a torrid departure from my understandable continuum. That thought was highly unwelcome in my mind. It left me wondering about my relationship to debt. I knew, in some way, that I should have asked Jan to return to her room. My failure to do so reflected the nature of my relationship with debt. I was loyal to debt. That much was obvious by my pointing out I was not single. It was also obvious by my stated intention of going to sleep. However, I did not feel innocent, and it was evident to me that any sense of my being in love with debt had ceased to be viable, and had not been viable for some time. How would I have acted if I was with Lindy Dale? I knew immediately. Jan would have had to have returned to her room. That could have been a ghastly revelation for anyone in a relationship, but somehow it was merely a stark fact of my existence. I'd already offered to spare debt my irritating association, and she'd performed a backwards flip. I wouldn't have been bereft by any means if we parted on that day. I was fond of debt, but love? No, that had gone. That had been squashed out of me. I remembered the words of Düd'jom Rinpoche. With each life circumstance, whatever is enacted, stare directly into the enactment with all the senses. When I woke, Jan was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, as waking up next to Jan would have been somewhat awkward. At breakfast, Jan was as cheery and bright as ever, and it was as if I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then she said, "You know, you really are the perfect old-fashioned gentleman. You and Jarvis have back-to-front ages. He's 42 and you're 22, but he's a teenager and you're an adult, and I'm nearly old enough to be your mother." I raised my eyebrows and made a movement with my right hand that requested her age. "A few years or so older than Jarvis." "You surprise me," I said in genuine surprise. "I thought you were in your early 30s. "There's no end to your gallantry, is there?" Jan laughed. "But hush now, we have the others joining us." Kate, Dot and Georgina joined us, and we plunged back into the stream of conversation that had continued almost unabated since I arrived. "I was just telling Kate," grinned Georgina, "that Chögyam reminds me of Adam Adamant." "Adam Adamant?" Jan queried. "He was a character on television back in about 66, 67 on the BBC, Kate responded. "He was some kind of adventurous hero who was supposed to have been born in 1867, but got put into some kind of hibernation and got revived in 1966. It was a fun show, a sort of comedy thriller. It was a satire about the 60s because the 60s are seen through the eyes of an honourable Victorian gentleman. He had an imposing name too, added Kate. Something like Adam Llewellyn de Vere Adamant. I sat, faintly bewildered, as I'd never seen the series. In those years I'd been fairly free of television, and most of my time had been absorbed with Savage Cabbage. What's the story with Adam Llewellyn de Vere Adamant? It seems I missed something on television after all. He's a swashbuckling Victorian hero, said Georgina, who I think, oh yes, he was this officer in the army, listed missing, presumed killed in 1902. Year my father was born, I added. Whoa, he was old then, when you were born, I mean, so maybe that accounts for it. Anyhow, he has to rescue his kidnapped fiancée. What's her name? Louise, answered Kate. Yeah, Louise. So he's lured into a trap, captured and frozen in a block of ice by his arch enemy who's called the Face, because he wears a leather mask all the time and speaks in this eerie whisper. The Face gives Adam Adamant a last request, and so he asks to see Louise. Yeah, then he makes this really nasty discovery, Kate chipped in. In his last moment before he's frozen, he discovers that Louise was never really kidnapped. She's been working for the Face all the time. So Adam Adamant gets found in 1966 when a building's being demolished. He's revived and gets out of hospital, but collapses somewhere in London where he gets rescued by this girl, Georgina. I was about 13 then and always liked that she was called Georgina. Sounds like a ripping yarn. I enjoy that kind of thing, and I can almost see myself being like this gentleman. Not that I think I'm a hero or anything, but maybe I like that archaic style of being honourable. Maybe I got that from my father. Now there's a thought. I never thought I'd find myself saying something like that. So, sorry, I interrupted your flow. No, that just makes it more interesting that we were talking about it. And so, anyway, although Georgina's a typical 60s hippie, Adam Adamant was her childhood hero, and she read all about his late 1800s adventures. So when Adam Adamant starts in on crime detection, she gets in on all his cases. He tries to stop her for her own protection, but she always sails in at the last moment to help. Better and better. A hippie heroine, I laughed. I love this story. So, right, Adam Adamant's this brilliant swordsman with this sword that comes out of a walking stick, and he's also a boxer and expert in judo and karate, so he can just about do anything. So anyhow, Georgina's threatened after seeing her grandfather being murdered by the mafia, and they're after her, and Adam Adamant saves her. There's also this mystery because no one knows where his money comes from, or how he rebuilds his old home on top of this multi-storey car park in London. The wild part is how he gets into his house in this secret lift that's hidden by a sliding wall. So, apart from my being somehow quaint, what's the similarity? Well, when the Face captures him, Louise, who betrayed him, tells him, "You're so clever, but oh so vulnerable." He has this Victorian naivety, you see, and that reminds us of you. I mean, I can't imagine any other man being coaxed into wearing Dot's knickers. Yes, you've got me there. Maybe that's just because I don't enjoy having limitations. Although I wouldn't argue about my naivety, I think that's probably accurate. Jan said nothing during the Adam Adamant exchange, but smiled occasionally and eventually said to me, almost in a whisper, "You'll even own up to naivety then. That's impressive." Jan evidently didn't expect an answer, so I simply smiled and gave a slight shrug of the shoulders. Once breakfast was over, I discovered that Kate was headed back to Liverpool that day, and so I offered her a lift. She was to have hitched from Sammy Ling, and I knew that would be difficult until she got to Lockerbie. Kate was evidently pleased with the prospect because more often than not people ended up walking most of the way to Lockerbie. The locals weren't that enthusiastic about picking up hitchhikers. "Do you have to leave soon?" she asked. "Yes, well, I don't have to head out immediately, but I need to get back to Bristol before it gets too late. I don't like driving when I'm overtired. Almost ended up dead doing that in Germany when I was 16. "Right, of course, but I was wondering, if you don't need to be back in Bristol for a day or so, I'd like to introduce you to my friends Amy and Atlas in Liverpool." "Atlas?" I queried, "as in Charles?" "No, but I can fill you in on that later. They're really interesting people and I think you'd really like them. They're really different and outside the establishment thing. I've known them for about 5 years and they've been really good friends. They don't lay any conventional conservative trips on you and they live life like art." "They sound like my friends in Bristol. The world needs more people like that, and I'm always happy to meet open-minded people." "Right, they're completely open-minded and free. You'll really get on with them well, and they'll really like you too." What could I say? Well, I could go back to Bristol a day or two later, but I'd have to make a few telephone calls. "Then we don't need to head out until just before lunch," Kate smiled. "I'd like to say goodbye to a few people and see the yaks one last time." Sorry, I forgot. I mean the yak and the dree. And so it was arranged. A leisurely departure seemed most welcome to me. I went upstairs and knocked on Jan's door. She opened the door and beckoned me to come in. "Just come to say goodbye," I said, "and to give you my address." Jan smiled, a little sadly, I thought, and said, "I think I'd better not take your address. I don't think it would be sensible." "I wasn't meaning," I started, but Jan interrupted. "No, of course not," Jan demurred. But I interrupted. "It's just that I've come to regard you as a good friend." "Yes," Jan replied, "and that's just what we are. But I'm not sure I trust myself as much as you trust yourself, if you understand." "Yes, I do. You really are a most remarkable person." I answered in some kind of strange daze or purple haze. "Well, maybe we'll meet again." "Don't know where, don't know when," Jan broke in with the words of the song. "But I'm sure we'll meet again one sunny day," I completed the line. "Yes, maybe we will. But before you leave, I'd like to give you a little advice, if you will hear it. Keep smiling through?" "I'm sure you will," laughed Jan, "but seriously." "Certainly," I smiled. "One can't get enough advice if it's kindly and intelligently given, as I'm certain it is." "Yes, it is. You're going to be taking Kate back to Liverpool, I hear." I nodded in the affirmative, and Jan continued, "Kate has spoken to me about her 2 friends, Amy and Atlas. They share a house with her in Liverpool. I don't know exactly how to put this, but I'm not sure they're your kind of people exactly. I've got no more to say than that because I may be entirely wrong, but take care. Keep your eyes wide open and remember to leave as soon as you want to leave. I thanked Jan for her advice. I told her that I'd not forget what she'd said, and suddenly wished she'd given her advice before I'd agreed to go to Liverpool. But what could happen beyond my finding these Amy and Atlas people uninteresting? They could turn out to be like the hippie cannibals in Jean-Luc Godard's Weekend. That was the last time I ever saw Jan. Goodbye forever.